The fluorescent lights of the CEO's office felt colder than usual. Lucas Brennan stood 3 feet from the woman who signed his paychecks, his throat dry, his hands frozen at his sides. 2 weeks ago, he didn't even know her name. 2 weeks ago, she was just a stranger crying alone on a rooftop while fireworks exploded above them. Now Caroline Whitmore sat behind a mahogany desk, worth more than his apartment, her perfectly manicured fingers trembling against the armrest. She wouldn't look at him. "Close the door," she said. Her voice cracked on the second word. The most powerful woman in the company, the one who never flinched in boardrooms full of sharks, suddenly looked like she might shatter. Then she whispered 5 words that would change everything. "I'm pregnant. It's yours." Lucas had spent 5 years protecting his daughter from chaos. He had promised himself no more broken families, no more shattered pieces for Rosie to pick up. The sheets still held the ghost of her warmth, and a single earring, a diamond stud, worth more than his car, glinted on the nightstand. He gathered his clothes, slipped out of the hotel, and walked home through the empty New Year's morning streets, telling himself it was better this way. Some people weren't meant to stay. The first company meeting of the new year was held in the main conference hall, a gleaming space of glass and steel designed to intimidate. Sunlight poured through floor-to-ceiling windows, making everyone squint as they found their seats. Lucas sat in the back row, coffee in hand, half listening as the HR director droned on about productivity goals and wellness initiatives. He was thinking about Rosie, about the drawing she'd made him that morning, a crayon family portrait, with just the 2 of them holding hands under a yellow sun. She had asked why he looked tired, and he had lied and said he hadn't slept well. And now, the HR director said, her voice brightening, "Please welcome our CEO, Caroline Whitmore, who will share her vision for the coming year." Lucas looked up as a woman walked onto the stage, and his coffee cup slipped from his fingers, sending hot liquid splashing across his shoes. It was her. The woman from New Year's Eve, the stranger who had cried in his arms, the one whose name he'd never learned, and whose face he couldn't forget. Caroline Whitmore stood at the podium in a tailored gray suit. Her hair perfectly styled her face, a mask of professional confidence that revealed nothing of the woman who had fallen apart in his arms 14 nights ago. She looked nothing like the broken woman on the rooftop, and yet when her eyes swept the crowd and landed on Lucas, he saw the flicker of recognition, the brief flash of panic before the mask slammed back into place. Her hand tightened on the podium until her knuckles went white. Her voice didn't waver. "Good morning, everyone. I hope you all had a restful holiday." Lucas couldn't breathe. He sat frozen in his seat, watching the woman who had spent one reckless night in his arms deliver a speech about innovation and market expansion, pretending she didn't know him, pretending that night had never happened. The earring in his jacket pocket suddenly weighed 1,000 pounds. The meeting ended, and Lucas tried to disappear. He gathered his things, kept his head down, and aimed for the exit, like a man escaping a burning building. His mind raced through possibilities. She was his boss, the CEO of the company where he'd worked for 8 years, the woman who could destroy his career with a single word. But before he could reach the door, a voice cut through the crowd, sharp, controlled, terrifying. "Mr. Brennan, my office. Now." He turned to find Caroline's assistant standing behind him, clipboard in hand, face carefully blank, in the way that only executive assistants could manage. There was no room for argument. Lucas followed her through the maze of corridors to the executive floor, each step feeling like a march toward his own execution. The carpet grew thicker, the art on the walls grew more expensive, and the silence grew heavier. The assistant opened the door to Caroline's office, gestured him inside, and closed it behind him with a soft click that sounded like a prison lock engaging. Caroline stood by the window, her back to him, silhouetted against the gray January sky. The city stretched out behind her like a kingdom, towers of glass and steel, that she had conquered through sheer will and determination. She didn't turn around. "Close the door," she said. Her voice was different now, strained, almost fragile. Nothing like the powerful CEO who had commanded a room of hundreds just moments ago. Lucas did as she asked, then waited in the silence that followed, his heart hammering against his ribs. When she finally turned to face him, the mask had slipped. The powerful CEO was gone, replaced by the woman from the rooftop, the one with mascara-streaked cheeks and too much pain in her eyes. She looked smaller, somehow, younger, like a child pretending to be an adult. "I'm pregnant," she said. The words hung in the air between them, heavy as stones. "It's yours, and I don't know what to do." Lucas felt the floor shift beneath his feet. His mind raced through calculations, the timing, the possibilities, the impossibility of what she was saying. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice hoarse. She laughed, that same broken sound from New Year's Eve. "I've taken 6 tests. I'm sure." The silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating. Lucas thought about Rosie, about the promise he'd made the day she was born, the day her mother had died in his arms, hemorrhaging on the delivery table, while doctors shouted orders he couldn't understand. He remembered the weight of his newborn daughter against his chest, remembered promising her that he would protect her from every storm the world could throw. He had sworn to himself that he would never let his daughter experience another loss, another upheaval, another broken family. He had spent 5 years keeping that promise, building a life so carefully controlled that nothing could disrupt it. And now, this woman, this stranger, was threatening to tear it all apart. "I don't need anything from you," Caroline said, her voice hardening like ice forming over water. "I just needed someone to know. I needed to not be alone with this, even for a minute." She turned back to the window, her shoulders rigid. "You can go now. Pretend this never happened. I won't hold it against you." Lucas should have left. Every instinct told him to walk out that door, to protect his daughter, to preserve the careful life he'd built from the ashes of tragedy. But something held him in place. Perhaps the memory of his wife's face in those final moments, the terror in her eyes, as she realized she wouldn't survive the way her hand had gripped his with a strength that should have been impossible. Perhaps the thought of Rosie, who asked him every night why she didn't have a mommy like the other kids, why their family was so small when everyone else seemed to have grandparents and aunts and cousins. Perhaps it was simply the sight of Caroline's trembling shoulders, the way she stood alone against the world, ready to face this impossible situation without anyone to hold her hand. "When's your next appointment?" he heard himself ask. Caroline went still. Slowly she turned to look at him, confusion and something like hope flickering across her face like sunlight through clouds. "What, your next doctor's appointment?" Lucas said. "When is it? I'll be there." The first ultrasound appointment was at a clinic across town, far from the office, far from prying eyes and wagging tongues. They arrived separately, Lucas in his worn sedan that had seen better decades, Caroline in a town car with tinted windows that screamed wealth and discretion, and met in the waiting room like strangers who happened to be reading the same magazine. The walls were painted a cheerful yellow that felt oppressive, and a television mounted in the corner played a cooking show that no one watched. The nurse called them back, her cheerful voice grating against the tension. Caroline lay on the examination table, her hands clasped over her stomach, her face a careful mask of composure that couldn't quite hide the fear in her eyes. Lucas sat in the corner on a plastic chair that squeaked every time he shifted, unsure whether he should be there, unsure whether he even had the right to witness this moment. The doctor applied gel to Caroline's abdomen, moved the wand across her skin with practiced ease, and suddenly the room filled with a sound that stopped Lucas's heart. A heartbeat. rapid, fluttering, impossibly strong, like a hummingbird trapped in a glass jar. Caroline's mask crumbled. Tears streamed down her face as she stared at the monitor, at the tiny blob of light that was impossibly a life they had created together in one reckless moment of loneliness and champagne. Lucas found himself reaching for her hand before he knew what he was doing. She gripped his fingers so tightly it hurt, but neither of them let go. "That's your baby," the doctor said, smiling. "Strong heartbeat. Everything looks perfect." Later in the parking lot, they sat in Lucas's car because it felt safer than her town car, more anonymous, more like a space where two ordinary people could have an ordinary conversation. The heating vents blew warm air that smelled like dust and old coffee, and outside the window, snow began to fall. Caroline stared out the windshield, her hand resting on her still flat stomach. "I was pregnant once before," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "When I was 24, I was just starting the company, working 18-hour days, living on energy drinks and stubbornness. My boyfriend, he came from money. Old money, the kind that came with expectations and obligations and a family name that had to be protected." She paused, her jaw tightening. "When I told him, he said I wasn't suitable. His exact words. He said his family would never accept someone like me, someone who came from nothing, someone who didn't have the right pedigree. He gave me an ultimatum, the baby, or him." Lucas didn't speak. He understood that some confessions required witness, not commentary, that some wounds needed to be exposed to air before they could begin to heal. But standing in that cold office watching this untouchable woman finally break, he realized something terrifying. Some promises were never meant to be kept. 2 weeks earlier, Lucas Brennan had no intention of attending the company's New Year's Eve party. He'd promised Rosie they would watch the ball drop together, just the two of them wrapped in blankets on their worn leather couch, with hot chocolate and the old movie marathon she loved. But that afternoon, his 7-year-old daughter developed a slight fever, and his mother-in-law insisted on coming over to help. Margaret had been his rock since Jenny died, the one person who understood that his grief wasn't weakness, but love that had nowhere to go. "Go," Margaret had said, pressing her palm against his cheek, the way she used to do with her own daughter. "You never go anywhere, Lucas. Rosie will be fine. She'll probably fall asleep before 9 anyway. I chose him," Caroline continued, her voice breaking. "Or maybe I chose the connections his family could offer. Either way, I made my choice. I told myself it was the smart decision, the practical decision. I told myself I could always have children later, when I was established, when I had proven myself." She finally turned to look at him, and Lucas saw 14 years of regret written across her face. "I've regretted it every day since, every single day. And now I have a second chance, and I'm terrified I'm going to ruin it." The weeks that followed settled into an uneasy rhythm. They met in secret parking garages with flickering lights, quiet cafes on the other side of the city where no one would recognize them, the clinic where the doctors knew them only as first names and asked no questions. Lucas began to see glimpses of the woman beneath the CEO armor, the one who didn't know how to cook anything beyond toast and scrambled eggs, who had never owned a pet because she traveled too much, who had a secret collection of romance novels hidden in her nightstand because she was embarrassed to admit she still believed in love. Caroline began to see glimpses of the man beneath the quiet IT worker, the one who had rebuilt his life from rubble one day at a time, who talked to his dead wife's photograph every night before bed, who had turned down 3 promotions because they would have required more hours away from Rosie. One evening, a crisis intervened. Lucas was supposed to meet Caroline for a routine checkup, but his mother-in-law called in sick, leaving him with no one to watch Rosie. He had no choice but to bring her to the office, settling her in the break room with crayons and a coloring book and strict instructions to stay put while he tried to finish a server update that couldn't wait. What he didn't expect was for Caroline Whitmore to walk into the break room an hour later, searching for coffee, and come face to face with a 7-year-old girl who looked up at her with curious eyes, the same shade as her father's. "Are you my dad's friend?" Rosie asked her crayon, pausing mid-stroke on a picture of a princess with improbably large eyes. "He doesn't have friends." Lucas arrived moments later, breathless and apologetic, but the damage was done. Caroline stood frozen, staring at the little girl who was coloring a picture of a house with a family. Inside a daddy, a little girl, and now freshly added a woman with dark hair standing next to them. "I gave you brown hair," Rosie announced proudly, "because your hair is pretty. It's like a horse's mane, the pretty horses in my book." Caroline couldn't speak. She excused herself quickly, retreating to her office, but something had shifted in a way that neither of them could ignore. That night, she texted Lucas for the first time, not about appointments or logistics, but about Rosie. "She seems like a wonderful kid," the message read. "You've done a good job. She's smart and kind, and she sees things that adults miss." Lucas stared at those words for a long time before he replied. "She's the best thing that ever happened to me. She's also the reason I can't mess this up." The response came immediately. "I know. Neither can I." From that point forward, Caroline began asking about Rosie, her favorite foods, her hobbies, her fears. Lucas began sharing stories, small moments from their daily life, the kind of details that only mattered to people who cared. And slowly, without either of them meaning to, they started to feel less like strangers and more like something else entirely. Lucas invited Caroline to dinner at his apartment, partly because he wanted her to see how he lived, partly because he wanted to stop hiding. His home was small, a 2-bedroom in a building that had seen better decades, but it was full of life. Rosie's drawings covered the refrigerator like a gallery of childhood imagination. Photographs lined every surface Rosie as a baby. Rosie on her first day of school, Rosie missing her 2 front teeth and grinning like she'd won the lottery. And in the corner, in a frame that had never been moved, a wedding photo of Lucas, and a woman with gentle eyes and the same smile Rosie had inherited. Caroline stood in the doorway, taking it all in, and Lucas saw her expression shift from curiosity to something softer, something almost like longing. "It's not much," he said, suddenly self-conscious. "But it's ours. It's beautiful," Caroline replied, and he knew she meant it. They ate pasta that Lucas made from a recipe his wife had taught him, sitting at a kitchen table, scarred by years of homework and art projects. Rosie chattered endlessly, telling Caroline about her school, her friends, her dreams of becoming a veterinarian, or maybe an astronaut, or maybe both. Caroline listened with an intensity that surprised Lucas, asking questions, laughing at Rosie's jokes, even letting the little girl paint her nails a glittering purple that clashed spectacularly with her designer dress. Later, after Rosie had fallen asleep on the couch with her head in Lucas's lap, Caroline helped wash the dishes. They stood side by side at the sink, their shoulders almost touching, the comfortable silence of 2 people who had stopped trying to pretend. "I never thought I'd want this," Caroline admitted quietly. "A family. A home that actually feels like a home." She looked around the small kitchen at the crayon drawings and the worn cabinets and the life that filled every corner. "But standing here, I understand why people fight for it." But the peace couldn't last. As Caroline's pregnancy progressed, so did the whispers. Someone had noticed her leaving work early. Someone had spotted her car at a clinic on the east side. Someone had seen her with a man who worked in IT. Someone far below her station. Someone who had no business being in her orbit. The rumors spread like wildfire, mutating with each retelling until the truth was buried beneath layers of speculation and scandal. Caroline dismissed the gossip, focusing on work, on the baby, on the strange new life she was building. But Lucas felt the walls closing in. His colleagues started looking at him differently, whispering behind his back, treating him like either a gold digger or a victim, depending on who was doing the talking. The breaking point came in the 28th week. Someone had followed them to the clinic and snapped a photograph Caroline Whitmore, visibly pregnant, walking through a parking lot with a man from her IT department. The image exploded across the internet, shared and reshared, until it reached the board of directors, the shareholders, the competitors, who had been waiting for any sign of weakness. Lucas was called to HR, accused of inappropriate relations and leveraging personal connections for professional advancement. Caroline was summoned before the board, given an ultimatum: resign quietly or face a public vote of no confidence. They wanted her gone, these men in suits, who had always resented her success, who had been waiting for her to stumble. And now she had given them the perfect weapon. The night before the emergency board meeting, Lucas sat in Rosie's room watching her sleep. Her small chest rose and fell. With the rhythm of dreams, her fingers curled around a stuffed rabbit that had once belonged to her mother. "Daddy." Her voice was sleepy, confused. "Why are you sad?" He hadn't realized he was crying. "I'm not sad, sweetheart. Just thinking." Rosie sat up, her dark hair tangled from the pillow. "Is it because of the pretty lady, the one with the baby in her tummy?" Lucas froze. "How do you know about the baby?" "I heard you talking on the phone," Rosie said matter-of-factly. "Daddy, are you in trouble because of her?" The question cut deeper than any accusation from HR. Lucas gathered his daughter in his arms, holding her tight. "No, sweetheart. I'm not in trouble. I'm just trying to figure out the right thing to do." "The right thing is to help people," Rosie said, as if it were the most obvious truth in the world. "That's what you always tell me." Caroline didn't run. She didn't hide. She didn't issue a carefully worded statement through her lawyers or spin the story into something more palatable. Instead, she walked into the all-hands meeting. The next morning, stood at the podium she had commanded 1,000 times before, and told the truth. "I'm pregnant," she announced, her voice steady, despite the tremor in her hands. "The father is a man I met on New Year's Eve, a man who works in this company, a man who has shown me more kindness and integrity than anyone I've ever known." The room went silent. "I'm not going to apologize for falling in love," she continued. "I'm not going to resign because some people are uncomfortable with my choices. What I am going to do is take a step back, not because I'm ashamed, but because I finally have something more important than this company. I'm stepping down as CEO. Not because you're forcing me to, but because I want to. I want to be present for my child in a way I never thought I could be. I want to build a family, a real family, with a man who doesn't care about my money or my power or my name." Rosie had looked up at him from the couch, her nose red, her eyes glassy but determined. "Daddy, you should go. You don't have any friends. Maybe you'll make one tonight." The words stung more than they should have, mostly because they were true. The rooftop of Whitmore Technologies headquarters had been transformed into something out of a magazine. String lights crisscrossed overhead like a canopy of captured stars. Champagne towers sparkled under the city glow, and clusters of employees in cocktail attire laughed too loudly, trying to impress people who would forget their names by Monday. A jazz quartet played something soft and melancholy in the corner, their music nearly lost beneath the chatter and clink of glasses. Lucas stood near the edge of the rooftop, nursing a glass of champagne. He didn't really want watching the city sprawl beneath him like a circuit board of flickering lights. She looked directly at Lucas, who sat frozen in the back row. "I choose him. I choose this." The applause started slowly, a single pair of hands somewhere in the middle of the room, then spread until the entire hall was standing, clapping, some people crying. But Lucas barely heard it. because even as Caroline spoke, even as she made the choice that should have freed them both, her face had gone pale. She gripped the podium, her knuckles white, and he saw the moment her eyes went wide with pain. She collapsed before anyone could reach her. Lucas was the first to catch her, the first to feel the wetness spreading across her dress, the first to hear her whisper, "Something's wrong. Lucas, something's wrong with the baby." The hospital corridors were a blur of fluorescent lights and shouted orders. Caroline was rushed into emergency surgery, while Lucas waited in a plastic chair, his hands still stained with her blood. 29 weeks. Too early. Much too early. He thought about his wife, about that terrible day 7 years ago, when he had sat in a chair just like this one, waiting for news that never came. He thought about Rosie, home with her grandmother, not knowing that her father's world was falling apart all over again. He thought about the baby, a baby he had never asked for, never planned for, but had somehow become the most important thing in his life. The surgery lasted 4 hours. Lucas paced the waiting room, called Margaret to check on Rosie, drank coffee he couldn't taste. When the doctor finally emerged, her face was exhausted, but not grim, and Lucas felt his knees go weak with relief. "She's stable," the doctor said. "The baby is in the NICU, a girl 2.1 pounds. She's small, but she's fighting. Caroline lost a lot of blood, but she's going to be okay." Lucas sank into a chair, his head in his hands. A girl. They had a daughter. He thought he should feel fear, anxiety, the crushing weight of responsibility. Instead, all he felt was a desperate, overwhelming need to see them both. They let him into Caroline's room first. She lay against the white pillows, pale and fragile, connected to machines that beeped a steady rhythm. Her eyes fluttered open when he took her hand. "The baby," she whispered. "She's okay," Lucas said, his voice breaking. "She's a fighter. Like her mother." Caroline's laugh was weak but real. "I was so scared. I thought I was going to lose everything again." Lucas brought her hand to his lips, kissed her fingers, tasted salt and antiseptic and hope. "You're not going to lose anything. I'm right here. I'm not going anywhere." Rosie FaceTimed at 2 a.m, unable to sleep, worried about her father. Lucas held the phone so Caroline could see, and the little girl's face lit up with recognition. "Pretty lady. Are you okay? Daddy said you were sick." "I'm getting better," Caroline said, her voice thin but warm. "Thanks to your daddy." Rosie was quiet for a moment, her small face serious beyond her years. "My mommy is in heaven," she said. "She watches over me when I'm scared. Maybe she can watch over your baby too." Caroline's composure shattered. Tears streamed down her face as she looked at this child, who had every reason to resent her, who had lost so much and yet offered only kindness. "I think she'd like that," Caroline whispered. "I think she's already watching." They named the baby Hope. Caroline had suggested it in the middle of the night, her voice hoarse from exhaustion and tears. "Because that's all we have right now," she had said. "And sometimes, that's enough." It seemed like the only name that fit, the only word that captured what she represented, this tiny miracle, who had arrived too soon but refused to give up. Hope spent 11 weeks in the NICU, growing stronger each day, her tiny fingers learning to grasp her lungs, learning to breathe without machines, her eyes finally opening to reveal the same shade of brown as her mother's. She was fighting with a determination that reminded Lucas of both her mothers, the one who had given him Rosie and the one who was learning that strength didn't always mean standing alone. Caroline spent every moment she could at her side, talking to her, singing to her, reading her stories, even though she couldn't possibly understand. Lucas brought Rosie to visit when the doctors allowed, and the little girl would press her hand against the incubator glass and whisper secrets to her baby sister. "I'm going to teach you how to ride a bike," she promised, "and how to paint, and how to make Daddy laugh when he's sad." 3 months after that terrifying night, Hope came home. Not to Caroline's penthouse, she had sold it, claiming it never felt like a home anyway, but to Lucas's small apartment, where the walls were covered with Rosie's artwork, and the kitchen smelled like pasta, and the furniture was worn but comfortable. Caroline had been coming every evening for weeks, learning the rhythms of their life, fitting herself into the spaces she had never known existed. She learned how to fold laundry, how to help Rosie with homework, how to argue about whose turn it was to wash dishes. She learned that a home wasn't built from marble and glass, but from laughter and mess and the quiet moments in between. The first night with Hope in the apartment, they sat on the living room floor, Lucas and Caroline and Rosie, with the baby sleeping in a second-hand bassinet between them. Rosie was teaching Caroline the words to a lullaby, the same one Lucas's wife used to sing, preserved on a video that he had watched 1,000 times. "Are you going to be my stepmom?" Rosie asked suddenly, the question hanging in the air like a held breath. Caroline looked at Lucas, her eyes asking a question she wasn't ready to voice. "We don't have to figure it all out tonight," Lucas said, pulling both girls close. "We have time." 1 year later, on New Year's Eve, they stood on the same rooftop where everything began. The string lights were the same. The champagne towers sparkled the same way, but everything else had changed. The company had given Caroline a consultant role enough to keep her connected to the work she had built, not enough to consume her life the way it once had. She had learned that success wasn't measured in quarterly reports and market share, but in first steps and bedtime stories, and the sound of her daughters laughing together. Lucas had been promoted to department director, not through favoritism, but because someone had finally noticed his work, the quiet competence, the steady presence, the way he solved problems without needing credit. Rosie perched on his shoulders, pointing at the fireworks with mittened hands, while Caroline held Hope against her chest, wrapped in a blanket covered with stars that Rosie had picked out herself. 10, 9, 8. The countdown rose around them, but this time, Lucas wasn't alone. This time, when he looked at the woman beside him, he saw not a stranger crying in the dark, but a partner, a mother, a future he had never dared to imagine. 7, 6, 5. Rosie drummed her hands against his head in excitement. Hope stirred her tiny fist, reaching toward the lights. 4, 3, 2, 1. "Happy New Year!" Rosie shrieked, and the sky exploded in gold. No one kissed at midnight. Instead, they stood together, 4 people who had found each other through chaos and heartbreak and the strange magic of a single night. Caroline leaned her head against Lucas's shoulder, and he felt her smile more than saw it. "This is the best New Year ever." Rosie declared the same thing she had said at every holiday since Hope came home. "Just wait," Caroline said, looking at Hope, then at Rosie, then finally at Lucas, the man who had stayed when he could have run, who had held her hand when she thought she was falling apart. "It's just the beginning." And standing on that rooftop with fireworks painting the sky, and his daughters in his arms, and a woman he loved pressed against his side, Lucas Brennan finally understood something he had spent 5 years trying to deny. Some promises were meant to be broken, because sometimes the thing you were protecting yourself from was exactly what you needed all along. The wind carried the scent of expensive perfume and winter frost, and somewhere in the distance, the first early fireworks began their premature celebration. He didn't belong here. He was the IT department head, the guy people called when their computers crashed, not the type to mingle with executives and make small talk about quarterly projections. He checked his phone for the 10th time, saw no messages from Margaret, and decided it was time to leave. He was about to set down his glass when he heard a sound so soft It almost disappeared into the winter wind. Someone was crying. She stood alone at the far corner of the rooftop, her back to the party shoulders, shaking beneath a black dress that probably cost more than his monthly rent. Her hair, dark and carefully styled, had started to come undone in the wind, and she clutched a champagne flute so tightly, Lucas worried it might shatter in her hand. The city lights reflected in the sequins of her dress, making her look like she was covered in fallen stars. He didn't recognize her. She must have arrived late after the official introduction, slipping in through a side entrance to avoid the crowds. He should have walked away. He should have minded his own business, gone home to his daughter, and forgotten this night ever happened. Instead, he found himself walking toward her, drawn by something he couldn't name. Perhaps the raw familiarity of her loneliness, a mirror of his own grief that he recognized like an old wound. "Rough night?" he asked, his voice barely audible above the distant thrum of music and laughter. She startled, turning to face him with mascara-streaked cheeks and eyes that held more pain than anyone should carry alone. For a moment, she seemed ready to dismiss him, to put on the mask he could see waiting just beneath the surface, the armor that people like her wore to survive. But something in his expression must have stopped her, because instead, she laughed a broken, bitter sound that cracked in the middle like thin ice. "You could say that," she said, wiping at her face with the back of her hand, smearing mascara across her cheekbone. "I just found out my fiancé has been sleeping with my business partner for the past year. Apparently the whole company knew, except me. Happy New Year to me." Lucas didn't know what to say, so he did what he always did. He stayed. He stood beside her, silent and present, watching the city lights blur through the champagne bubbles rising in his glass. They talked for hours, two strangers sharing secrets they'd never told anyone. She didn't offer her name, and he didn't ask. It felt safer that way, like a confession booth, where anonymity granted absolution. She told him about building her company from nothing, about sleeping on office floors and surviving on ramen, and determination when investors laughed at her business plan. She told him about the sacrifices she'd made, the relationships she'd destroyed in pursuit of success, the friends who had become strangers when she couldn't make time for anything but work. He told her about losing his wife during childbirth, about the terrifying moment when the doctor stopped talking and started moving with an urgency that meant something had gone horribly wrong. He told her about raising Rosie alone, about learning to braid hair by watching YouTube videos at 3 a.m, about the guilt that still woke him, wondering if he was enough. "I don't do families," she said at one point, her voice hard, but her eyes soft. "I learned that lesson the hard way a long time ago. Some people aren't meant for that kind of life." Lucas didn't argue. He understood better than most that some wounds never fully healed, that some people built walls, not to keep others out, but to keep themselves from falling apart. When the countdown began, neither of them moved toward the crowd. They stayed in their corner, watching fireworks explode across the sky in bursts of gold and silver and red. 10, 9, 8. The voices rose around them, a chorus of hope and champagne-fueled optimism. 7, 6, 5. She turned to look at him. Really look at him, and Lucas saw something in her eyes that made his breath catch a raw vulnerability that contradicted everything about her polished exterior. 4, 3, 2. Later, he would tell himself it was the champagne. He would tell himself it was the loneliness, the shared grief, the strange intimacy of two broken people finding each other in the dark. 1. Happy New Year. She kissed him first. Or maybe he kissed her. In the chaos of fireworks and cheering, it was impossible to tell who moved first. Only that suddenly, her lips were on his, and his hands were in her hair, and the world had narrowed to this single reckless moment of surrender. What happened next shouldn't have happened. They both knew it even as they stumbled into the elevator, even as she pressed the button for the penthouse suite, even as clothes fell to the floor, and boundaries dissolved into skin and breath, and the desperate need to feel something other than alone. Her perfume smelled like jasmine and winter, and her skin was softer than anything he'd touched in 5 years. It was a mistake, a beautiful, devastating mistake that would haunt them both. When Lucas woke the next morning, the bed beside him was empty. No note, no name, no trace of the woman who had made him forget, just for one night, how heavy the world could be.